Hey there, welcome to East and West. Let's talk about the Kirishima Thing.
Kirishima?
Kirishima? てかいるKirishima。
ざけんなKirishima。Kirishima君休みかな。
Kirishimaが部活辞めたんだって。
自分だけが置いていけぼ。
Based on the 2010 novel by Ryo Asai, the film is a high school set drama that was premiered early in 2012. The plot of the film is as follows. After Kirishima, a popular sports star at the school, suddenly vanishes for no discernible reason, the effect of his disappearance starts being felt throughout all aspects of the school, everyone from his teammates, all the way down to a geeky guy with a film camera. And that's basically it. Yeah, this film doesn't really have much in the way of story. There's no real conflict, there's no significant arcs, there's not even really a linear narrative, as it were. It's a slice-of-life movie about how this particular event starts affecting everyone, as basically everyone just goes about doing their own thing and having their own issues. And as a side note, Kirishima, the actual title character, never appears in the film. Well, actually that's not entirely true. He appears for like 3 seconds at one point. Maybe. I mean, we're never actually given any actual confirmation it was him, so it could have been somebody else. Possibly. Regardless, despite the fact that the title character has literally almost no presence in this film whatsoever, the film does end up doing a really good job at showing how this guy disappearing ends up having consequences for all these random students. And what makes it even more interesting is the fact that most of these students basically don't even know this guy. They simply know people who know other people, but because this guy was as such a big deal as he apparently was, you get to see sort of how this event ends up kind of rippling through the entire population. Which doesn't sound interesting, but it works really well here, especially because of how they show it. I mentioned about a minute ago now that this film doesn't really have a linear narrative, but that's not quite true. It does have a linear narrative, it just tells it multiple times. When the film first starts, the opening text simply says Friday, and then goes about playing through the events of the first day when this guy ends up disappearing. But then, after about 10 minutes, the text shows up again, and then the film replays the same events, but this time from the perspectives of different characters. And you know what? This is actually a really cool idea. This setup is done extraordinarily well, and I think there's a few different factors that contribute to that. The first of which is what I've ended up calling the film's linchpin moments. As the day keeps being replayed, the film starts using very key and very recognizable moments when the characters start interacting, and then uses those moments to transition between the points of view of the multiple characters. Meaning that, as the days continue to repeat, you're not just focusing on a single character throughout each iteration. So, for example, let's say you're restarting one of these cycles, and you start by focusing on one particular character. Then, as the film plays through, you get to a very certain moment where a second character just runs past. Alright, that's it, they don't actually have any interaction, you just have a second person running past the character you're following, and then past a third person as well. And so what would happen now is that the film would use this moment to switch from following the first character to now focusing on the third character and having the story continue in that direction. And then, when the day resets itself, we might end up following the second person. And then that particular moment will appear again, and it will once again switch, but this time it will follow the first person that we were following. And what ends up happening is exactly what I said before. The fact that, even though occasionally these characters aren't even directly interacting with each other, it still ends up resulting in a very distinct chain of events that keeps unfolding as the film continues. And the other really good thing they do is that they use the day reset idea to also show different times of the day, as well as just different characters and locations. And what this enables them to do is better capitalize on the world building that ensues from limiting the knowledge of the viewers independently of the characters. And because that sounds a little bit confusing, let me give you a perfect example. In the very first section of this movie, we have this particular moment where the character of, well, popular girl, I guess, and she ends up talking to this particular filmmaking kid, who is not the main character of the film, but considering the fact that his face is plastered over a majority of the advertising, you can be forgiven for thinking that he was. Regardless, she ends up mocking him about something that happened earlier at the morning assembly, something that is never actually specified and we haven't seen. But then later on the second day reset, we actually get to see the event in question taking place. And suddenly, not only that moment, but a number of other moments that have happened between then and now, that were never quite explained, suddenly, they've got a lot more context to them as well. Another example is when they decide to end the day directly before two characters end up confronting each other. Then, on the reset, after they have shown the other side of what has led up to this moment, they then actually continue and have the confrontation. Really, this aspect of the film is inventive, it is fantastically well done, and I basically have no complaints about it whatsoever. That is, until the film just sort of forgets about that whole aspect of itself. I have absolutely no clue what happened here, but after the first 40 minutes of this really quite ingenious setup, the film finally decides to progress forward in time to Saturday. 2 minutes later, it's now Sunday. And then 4 minutes after that, it's now Monday. And before anybody asks, no, at no point in the rest of the film do they ever come back to these 2 days. What, pray tell, happened? Seriously, did they just forget what film that they were making? Did they just decide that they didn't need to use this style anymore? Did the corporate executives decide that it was going to be too confusing for people to follow? Was it simply the case of, who knows, maybe this was never actually intended in the first place and it was just somebody mucking about in the editing department? I don't know, alright? All I know is that after this technique stops being in use, this film goes downhill fast. Especially because, and I'm just going to be brutally honest here, if it wasn't for this technique, this wouldn't have been a good film from the beginning. The storylines are weak, the dialogue is quite boring, the cast is... I'm not going to call them bad, but most of them are ridiculously miscast. I mean, come on, half of these supposed high school students, they look older than me, for crying out loud. And the characters themselves, they really aren't that interesting, and with the actual plot of the film being as vague as it is, there's not really much you can do with them. But it didn't end up actually mattering that much, because with the technique they were using, it pushed the focus more towards the actual interactions between the characters, rather than the individual storylines. As an example, let's focus on this particular saxophone playing girl that appears quite often. The main story she has is that she is crushing on one of the other characters, and as such, she decides to put herself in a multitude of situations where he's around and hopefully he will notice her. That's it. It isn't particularly thrilling stuff, but what made it interesting was seeing how she reacts to other people, how she reacts to her classmate that knows what she's doing, how she reacts when she ends up being a direct inconvenience to one of the other characters when she does this. Even how the guy in question reacts to her doing this, as do the other guys that he's around, how they react to what she was doing. This is the stuff that was interesting because it was all about how this particular web of connections was starting to take place, and how each character either advertently or inadvertently was having a connection built to each of these other characters. It's almost like watching a set of dominoes starting to fall, and because of the way the editing style worked and how quickly that it was switching between characters and perspectives and storylines, especially when there are as many as there were. I mean, there's like 10 different major players in this film, each with their own unique individual storylines. There really isn't that much room for complexity involved. And because of how rapidly they were doing these storyline switches, they had to be simple by design so that it wasn't an inherently massive task to try and keep track of what was happening to each of these individuals. I mean, remember, this isn't like some high-laced political thriller here, it's still high school. So when they actually try and focus on these storylines, it ends up feeling exactly as boring as they are. As I said, these characters, there's barely anything to them. They are half-note characters, at best. All of their personalities are directly tied to their storylines. So when you take away the relationship aspects of that, which... don't get me wrong, they do focus on the relationship aspects in the second half. It's definitely there, but it is in nowhere as prominent as it was in the beginning. But when you take away actually seeing how these characters are connected, as limited and as minute as some of these connections actually were, but when you take that away, there's really not that much for the film to stand on. and yet the entire second half of the film is like this. It is completely linear, it is completely uncharacterized, and it's completely uninteresting. Well, except for the fact that it shows a couple of black and white gore horror movies in the middle. But the absolute worst moment in this entire film happens right at the end. After 40 minutes that this film goes on, the actual title event itself resurfaces. Yeah, remember there was actually meant to be a central idea to this movie. The missing kid apparently appears on the roof of one of the school buildings, and what happens is, well, chaos ensues as all of the predominant characters in this film start now calling out to each other and following other characters as they all end up trying to get to this one central place. Which, had the film actually still been focusing on how these characters were interconnected, would actually be a really cool scene, because the entire web that would be spinning would now start to be getting tighter, and all the things start mingling over with each other. As it is, the fact that we have been focusing on each individual completely separately, all this scene does is really show exactly how random this particular group actually is. Eventually, they all make it up to the roof, but instead of finding the title character, they instead run into the film kid, who is with a bunch of random characters as they are trying to film a B-grade zombie movie, which, unfortunately, has been his major arc throughout most of the second act, and is a lot less interesting than it sounds like it probably should be. So now we have all of the main characters in the film actually in one place and forced to interact with each other, and, as should probably be expected, tensions start running a little bit high. And eventually they hit breaking point when one of the lesser of the main characters ends up breaking one of the props that the film kid was using, and the film kid decides to actually call him out on it. Then we have people yelling either against people, or sometimes it's for other people, and this really should be a tense moment, but it just isn't, and eventually it ends up evolving into an actual physical fight. And regardless of the fact that the call to arms is completely ridiculous in and of itself, the film kid ends up grabbing his camera and starts filming the actual fight taking place. Except what we see is this. When I first saw this, what I originally thought was happening is that some point long after these events take place, the film guy has taken the footage that he shot here today and has somehow managed to edit it to look like this. And that what the film was doing is essentially the direct opposite of what it was doing at the beginning, where instead of flashing backward, this is now a flash forward. And what would happen is that we would now probably pan off the screen and see a number of the main characters now watching this movie, and then there'd be a little bit of exposition as to how these characters were actually affected by the events this day, and what the ending results of these events actually ended up being. Yeah, that doesn't happen. No, what I eventually realized is that this is meant to be what this guy is imagining. This is actually meant to be his perspective. This is meant to be what's actually in his head. But at no point do we see anything like this from any of the other characters. It's all been in third person to now, suddenly it's in first person, and to top it all off, this scene is just stupid! I mean, don't get me wrong. This is exactly what I expect a B-grade horror film to look like. So what, pray tell, is it suddenly doing right in the middle of this film? I mean, at least when they did the black and white horror films, that actually made sense because, you know, people were actually watching those things. But here, it's almost like the actual filmmakers just sort of wanted to mess around with some sort of special effect, but they had nowhere else to go, so they just decided, well, put it in here. We can make up some reasoning to have actual flesh being ripped off people. Yeah, that's a thing that happens in a high school drama, right? This is one of the biggest tonal whiplashes I have seen in any movie. This thing is so completely ridiculous, it is not even funny. And immediately after that, the movie just ends. And that is barely an exaggeration. Immediately after this scene, the film decides, for the first time since the 40-minute mark, mind you, to actually reset the day. Yeah, it finally does what it was doing so well at the start. We then spend 5 minutes trying to give some level of characterization to two of the least interesting people in all of cinemas, and then roll credits. Nothing has been learned. Nothing has been resolved. Nothing has come from the actions of any of these people, and it isn't even like it's hinted at or there's a feeling that these events are just going to be continuing anyway. No, it just stops. And worst of all is that the actual event that started off this whole thing, you know, the story about the guy going missing, the film doesn't even try to bring up some sort of explanation about it. It just completely ignores it almost as though it didn't even exist. Frankly, I can't even call this lazy writing, okay? This is just straight up bad. And you know what? This film won the 2013 Japanese Academy Prize for Picture of the Year. Literally, the only thought I have about how this could happen is if all the judges of these awards just stop watching this film after the first half. I mean, it's either that, or I'm really, really lucky that I haven't watched any other 2012 Japanese films yet. All in all, had this film actually kept the formatting that it had at the beginning, I would be thoroughly recommending it right now. Even though it clearly had its problems, it still had enough style to make me overlook it, and hopefully other people as well. This could have been a really interesting film, but unfortunately, it just isn't. I give this film 2 sports clubs and 5 days of the week. So that was my review of the Kirishima Thing. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for watching. Till next time. Hey there, welcome to East and West. Let's talk about the Kirishima Thing.
Kirishima?
霧島てかいる霧島
県の霧島君休みかな。
霧島が部活